They say that curiosity is a quiet thing. A whisper. But out in the deep folds of East Texas, where the pines grow so thick they drink the sunlight before it hits the forest floor, curiosity doesn't whisper. It beckons. It was October when the call came in. 3 hikers, experienced, the type who marked their maps with red ink and checked the weather twice. They found it off an unmarked service road, a structure the county surveyor swore didn't exist the week before. A cabin, low roof, single window, black as a closed eye. The wood wasn't rotted. The porch didn't creak. It sat there like it had been waiting, patient as a spine, for someone to knock. And here is the detail that keeps the investigators up at night. They didn't force the door. They didn't break in. The latch turned easily under a gloved hand, swinging inward on hinges that made no sound. As if the cabin was always expecting visitors. As if it had already set a place for them at the table. We know they went inside because the last ping from the eldest's phone placed them exactly 42 feet from the road. We know they didn't come out because the ranger found their packs still leaning against the wall, water bottles half full, a camera on the floor with the lens cap still in someone's pocket. The cabin is gone now. Demolished. Burned. But the ground where it stood won't take grass. Won't take seed. Just bare, cold dirt. And sometimes, late in the season, when the wind bends the pines just right, you can hear the latch turning. In, out, waiting for the next curious hand. The universal lure of the unknown is perhaps the oldest thread in the human tapestry, woven into our earliest myths and our quietest impulses. It is the reason children peel back rocks to see what writhes beneath, why explorers burn their ships on distant shores, why your eyes drift to the unmarked door in the hallway rather than the well-lit room. We are, at our core, creatures who walk toward the gap in the fence. The myth of safety in isolation is the lie we tell ourselves to justify that walk. We believe that if we are smart enough, prepared enough, or simply lucky enough, the unknown will remain a spectator sport, something we can glance at from a safe distance and then retreat from, unscathed. This is the contract we imagine we have with darkness. I will look, but I will not touch. I will approach, but I will not enter. The cabin in the pines accepted no such contract. Consider how deeply this myth is embedded in our survival instincts. We build walls, lock doors, establish perimeters. We teach children to recognize stranger danger, to stay on the path, to come home before the streetlights flicker on. We convince ourselves that danger wears a uniform, that it is loud, that it announces itself, that it carries a weapon or a snarling mouth. But the unknown rarely arrives with teeth bared. It arrives quiet. It arrives patient. It arrives looking like a cabin on a mild October afternoon, steam rising gently from the chimney as if someone inside is merely brewing tea. This is the cruel genius of the lure. It mimics safety. It borrows the architecture of shelter and repurposes it as bait. The 3 hikers were not foolish. They carried emergency beacons. They had left their itinerary with a relative. They understood the woods, the way light bends through loblolly pines, the sound of feral hogs moving through underbrush, the precise temperature at which sweat turns cold on your spine. They knew how to be afraid. But knowing fear and heeding it are separate muscles, and the unknown does not attack the body first. It attacks the question mark behind the breastbone. What is that? It asks. And because we are human, because we are the species that named the stars and buried our dead with flowers, we cannot help but answer. We cannot help but step closer. This is the thread that connects every ghost story, every missing person report filed in a small town sheriff's office, every cold case stamped with the words, "No evidence of foul play." The unknown does not need to be hostile to be lethal. It only needs to be compelling enough to draw the foot across the threshold. The myth of safety in isolation insists that we can stand at the edge and remain untouched. But the edge, by its very nature, is where you begin to lean. And once the weight shifts, once the curiosity outweighs the caution, the door is already swinging shut behind you, even if you cannot yet hear the click of the latch. We must confront the uncomfortable possibility that the cabin did not trap them at all. Perhaps it merely opened, and they walked inside exactly as they were made to, curious, believing themselves separate from the darkness, still clutching the warm illusion that they could always turn back. But some doors do not swing both ways. Some thresholds forgive one direction only. And the part of us that leans, that looks, that reaches out a hand toward the unmarked door, that part does not believe it will ever be the part that fails to return. The cabin did not emerge from the trees like a forgotten memory. It squatted there as though it had never been absent, as though the forest had simply exhaled and left it behind. This is the first terror of the structure itself, not that it was ruined or threatening in any obvious way, but that it appeared too intact, too composed, too aware of its own presence. The wood was the color of old bone, silvered by weather but not softened by rot. The single window faced the path like a patient eye, unblinking, its glass so dark that the light seemed to fall into it rather than reflect off it. And the porch, that narrow lip of a porch, did not creak or sigh under the weight of boot leather. It received the hikers in absolute silence, as though it had been holding its breath for years and would not dare exhale until they were well inside. We speak of places having atmosphere, but this is a gentling of the truth. Some places do not merely possess atmosphere, they possess intent. The cabin did not look abandoned in the way of most forgotten structures, those sad assemblies of rot and vandalism that wear their emptiness like a wound. It looked expectant. It looked prepared. The door hung plumb and true, its latch oiled, its frame unswollen by humidity. A less observant hiker might have registered this only as vague unease, that particular prickle at the nape that we are trained to ignore in polite company. But the detail matters. The cabin was not decaying. It was waiting. And waiting structures are not passive, they are predators practicing stillness. Consider the architecture of hunger. A mouth is just a cavity until it opens, until the space inside becomes invitation. The cabin's door was exactly that, a mouth held in that terrible instant before the tongue moves, before the throat widens. The hikers did not see it this way, of course. They saw shelter, warmth, a reprieve from the dropping October temperature. They saw four walls and a roof and the reasonable assumption that someone had built this place for human habitation. They did not see that the cabin had built itself around the absence of humans, that every board and nail and pane of glass was arranged specifically to receive the living and return them to the earth in a different form. This is how the most patient predators hunt. They make themselves look like refuge. They make themselves look like home. The pine forest that surrounded the cabin was not innocent in this arrangement. Those trees did not simply grow there. They stood as sentinels, their needles dark and dense, blotting out the sky in a slow conspiracy of shade. They muffled sounds so that no bird call or distant engine reached the clearing. They swallowed footprints and snapped twigs and the hushed voices of the hikers as they debated their next move. The cabin did not need to hide, the forest hid for it, wrapped it in silence and shadow, presented it to the weary travelers as a gift. And a gift, once accepted, carries obligation. The cabin knew this. It knew that the moment those hikers placed their hands on the latch, they were no longer visitors. They were offering. The horror of the cabin is not that it was grotesque or visibly malevolent. The horror is that it was beautiful in the way of things that have never been touched by vandalism or weather or time. It was preserved, and preservation implies purpose. Something had kept this cabin intact through storm and season, through the slow decay of decades, through every shift of wind and root and animal migration. Something had maintained the seal on that door, the clarity of that black window, the silence of that receiving porch. And when the hikers stepped inside, the cabin finally fulfilled the function it had been holding open for, waiting, hungering, patient as the grave. The easiest comfort we offer ourselves when hearing of tragedy is the swift classification of the victim. They were reckless, we tell ourselves. They were young, intoxicated by youth or substances or the intoxicating belief in their own invincibility. They took risks we would never take, ignored warnings we would have heeded, walked through doors we would have turned from. This taxonomy of the dead is not cruelty but self-defense. If we can locate the specific flaw in their judgment, we can assure ourselves that we possess the opposite virtue. We will not disappear because we are not like them. We are careful. We are sober. We are the kind of people who check the weather and mark our maps and tell the ranger exactly which trail we intend to walk. The cabin in the pines dismantled this comfort with surgical precision because the three hikers were precisely the kind of people we imagine ourselves to be. They were not teenagers hunting ghosts or urban explorers chasing internet fame. The eldest was 34, a civil engineer who spent his weekdays calculating load-bearing capacities and stress tolerances. He understood structural integrity, he knew how much weight a porch could hold, how much force a door frame could withstand. His sister was 29, an emergency room nurse who had spent a decade reading the subtle physics of trauma, the angle of impact, the depth of wound, the precise moment when intervention becomes impossible. Their companion was 31, a wildland firefighter who had spent 16 seasons reading the language of forests, who could smell rain 3 hours before it arrived and predict the path of a fire by the way smoke leaned into wind. These were not people who startled at shadows or mistook coincidence for omens. These were people trained to assess danger, to measure risk in calibrated increments, to act rather than freeze. This is the detail that refuses to settle. They did not enter the cabin impulsively. They circled it first, a full perimeter sweep, the firefighter noting the absence of animal tracks near the foundation, the engineer observing that the roof bore no sag despite apparent age, the nurse cataloging the silence that pressed against the clearing like a weight. They discussed it. They debated. They weighed the impropriety of entering private property against the dropping temperature and the failing light. They made a rational decision based on reasonable evidence. The cabin appeared sound, appeared vacant, appeared to offer exactly what they needed. They were not fleeing fear, they were exercising judgment. And their judgment, calibrated by years of professional training and lived experience, told them that the door would open, that shelter was shelter, that four walls and a roof contained no inherent malice. The horror of their competence is that it rendered their disappearance inexplicable. When the ranger found their packs arranged neatly against the interior wall, water bottles half drunk and oriented upright, the scene did not suggest struggle or surprise or sudden flight. It suggested deliberation. It suggested that they had entered, had settled in, had begun to make themselves comfortable in a space that had already decided to keep them. There were no signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no blood. They did not fight because there was nothing visible to fight. They did not flee because there was no visible direction of escape. They simply stopped being outside the cabin and started being inside it, and then they stopped being at all. This is the question that keeps the investigators returning to the bare dirt where the cabin once stood. If these three could not save themselves, what hope is there for the rest of us? We have stripped away every comforting distinction. They were not young, not foolish, not careless, not unprepared. They were us with better training and clearer vision. They were us walking toward the door we also would have opened, believing, as we believe, that competence is armor, that experience is shield, that the unknown respects credentials and yields to expertise. The cabin did not care about their resumes. It did not care that they had saved lives and calculated stresses and read the weather in the bent spine of smoke. It opened, and they entered, and the door closed behind them, and the forest returned to its long and patient silence. The scene that greeted the hikers was not merely intact, it was staged with the unsettling precision of a room arranged for guests who have not yet arrived but are expected imminently. This is the detail that separates the merely abandoned from the truly terrible. A forgotten cabin accumulates disorder, dust in slow conquest, animal nests in the corners, the gradual surrender of human order to natural entropy. But the interior of this cabin held dust at bay. The table stood centered beneath the window, its surface clean enough to reflect the gray October light. 2 chairs were pushed in, not haphazardly, but aligned with the table edges at perfect right angles. A third chair sat slightly apart, as though someone had recently risen from it and intended to return. There was no mail, no calendar, no photograph, no personal artifact of any kind. The cabin contained furniture but no life, arrangement but no inhabitant. It was a stage awaiting actors, a set awaiting script, a mouth awaiting the warm rush of breath across its silent tongue. The eerie perfection of the scene operated on the hikers in ways they could not articulate and therefore could not resist. The engineer noted the precise 90-degree angles of the chair placement and felt, perhaps, a professional appreciation for craftsmanship. The nurse observed the absence of vermin droppings, the lack of mold scent, the way the air inside tasted neutral rather than stale. The firefighter registered that the wood stacked beside the hearth was uniformly split, dried, arranged in a basket weave pattern that maximized airflow and burn efficiency. These were not signs of abandonment. These were signs of maintenance without maintainer, of care without caretaker, of a space that sustained itself through means that defied physical explanation. The cabin did not look as though someone had left it. It looked as though someone had just stepped out and might return at any moment, and that perpetual near absence exerted a gravitational pull on the rational mind. Consider how deeply we are conditioned to respond to domestic order. A made bed signals safety, a swept floor signals welcome, a lit hearth signals hospitality. The cabin deployed these signals with ruthless economy, offering the hikers exactly the visual vocabulary of shelter they had been trained since childhood to trust. There was nothing threatening about clean dishes drying on a rack, about a cast iron skillet hung precisely on its hook, about a braid of dried herbs suspended from a ceiling beam. These objects whispered home in a language older than speech, and the hikers, cold and tired and miles from their own warm beds, were fluent. They did not see a trap. They saw a gift. They did not see an absence. They saw an invitation. The horror is that they were correct in every perception except the final, fatal one. The cabin was indeed inviting them. The invitation was not to shelter but to sacrifice. The perfect order of the cabin was not evidence of recent habitation but of arrested time. Nothing in that room had decayed because nothing in that room was permitted to decay. The herbs remained green though no sun reached them. The skillet held no film of oxidation though the air carried moisture. The chairs aligned themselves again each night after the rangers finally broke the seal and documented the scene, though no hand touched them. The cabin was not frozen, it was waiting, and its waiting took the form of an eternal present tense in which the kettle was always just below boiling, the bed always freshly turned down, the door always unlocked. This is the perfection that compels rather than comforts, the sense that one has arrived not at a destination but at a pause, and that the pause will end only when the proper offering is made. The hikers entered, and the cabin resumed its interrupted sentence. They were not visitors. They were punctuation. They were the period at the end of a long, patient, and terribly lonely paragraph, and the forest read their absence in the satisfied silence that settled over the clearing like a held breath finally released. The moment the latch clicked into place behind them, the cabin ceased to be a structure and became a container. This is the distinction that haunts every investigation, every interview with the ranger who found their packs still warm against the wall, every attempt to reconstruct the final moments of people who left no final words. An invitation extended is not yet a trap, an invitation accepted is a door that now swings only one way. The hikers did not lock themselves in. The cabin did not need locks. It simply closed its mouth and began the slow, patient work of digestion. There was no violence because violence implies resistance, and resistance implies a self separate from the space that contains it. The cabin did not attack them. It absorbed them. It pulled them into its perfect stillness and held them there, not as prisoners but as components, as necessary and silent as the chairs aligned at right angles, the herbs suspended in eternal green, the skillet waiting for a hand that would never again grasp its handle. The transition from invitation to trap is rarely announced. This is perhaps the deepest horror of the cabin's mechanism, that the hikers almost certainly did not recognize the moment they became trapped. They were still assessing, still cataloging, still performing the mental calculations of people who believe themselves autonomous agents in a neutral environment. The engineer noted the solidity of the door frame, the absence of draft, the way the structure held heat with impressive efficiency. The nurse checked her phone, registered the absence of signal, reminded herself that dead zones were common in deep forest and that their planned check-in time was still hours away. The firefighter knelt at the hearth, arranged kindling, struck a match, watched the first delicate fingers of flame lick at the edges of bark. They were making a home. They were settling in. They were performing the oldest human ritual of transforming space into shelter, and they did not understand that the shelter was transforming them in return. Consider the geometry of a trap. A cage announces itself through bars, a snare through the sudden tension of rope around ankle. These are honest mechanisms, they wear their intent openly. But the cabin's containment was architectural rather than mechanical. It did not restrain the hikers because it did not need to restrain them. It simply held them in the gentle, unyielding grip of its own stillness. They did not try the door because they had no reason to try it.